All right, so first off, I want to talk about the importance of rangelands. So rangelands do cover about half of the Earth's land area. Globally, the top meter of grassland soil has about 50% more carbon than what is stored in forests worldwide. So I think there's a lot of connotation with high carbon sequestration in forests, but our rangelands are just as important. So with this high potential for carbon sequestration, it is important that we determine the proper management practices of our grasslands and rangelands so that we can have optimum soil carbon storage. One of these management practices is grazing. Grazing has been shown to stimulate herbaceous growth and improve nutrient cycling of the land. A study done by Derner et al. Showed that grazing increases your plant basal area, which is like the part of the plant right above the soil. And then it also increases your root biomass, which is the below ground root system. So that increasing of basal area and root biomass increases your potential for capturing nutrients below ground. Also, grazing allows for animals to walk across the ground, and that trampling improves physical breakdown of all of your above ground vegetation and litter, which enhances the decomposition rate and transfer of those nutrients below ground. Further, there was a study done that showed that ungrazed land allows for weedy annual forbs and grasses that lack the dense root systems ideal for carbon storage to really take over the land. So when you have grazing, you can have high forage grasses, which has dense fibrous root systems that are conducive to carbon sequestration. So overall, grazing is beneficial for carbon storage. In Florida specifically, there are 3 different types of grazing lands. On the left here, you can see an improved pasture. Improved pastures are fertilized. They're planted with Bahia grass or some other, high productivity forage grass. They're usually heavily ditched, and they have higher animal use days or higher stocking density. Out here at Buck Island Ranch, there's 414.5 animal use days per hectare per year on our improved pastures. These numbers are on an average of the last 5 years of our animal use days. And then on the right, we have a semi-native pasture. Those are never fertilized. They're only sprinkled with Bahia grass. They're lightly ditched, and they do have lower animal use days or stocking density. As you can see, our improved pastures here on the left is really just a sea of the same type of grass. It's like a monoculture of that Bahia grass, where those semi-native pastures do have several different types of grasses and native vegetation. The third type of grazing land out here in Florida is native rangelands, which are really mostly untouched and not managed. We won't really be talking about that today. Also, out here in Florida, we do have ranch lands that are becoming increasingly taken over by the state for, conservation protection, or they're taken into conservation easements. So when this happens, the management intensity or management style tends to change, oftentimes having no grazing at all. So it's important for us to look at the effective grazing or the lack of grazing on these ecosystems and how it changes these regulation services like carbon sequestration. Chris Wilson did a study back in 2018 on Buck Island Ranch's improved pastures, and he wanted to assess the soil carbon levels of our pastures. He found that the grazed areas have higher root biomass, which is associated with higher soil organic carbon. So we wanted to do a study on semi-native pastures. So the objective of our study was to assess the impact of grazing and soil depth on soil carbon levels in semi-native pastures. We looked at 15-year-old grazing exclosures to act as our ungrazed area, and then grazed paired plots. In order to measure our soil carbon levels, we measured soil organic carbon, total carbon, root biomass, bulk density, which is how compact your soil is, so how tightly together your particles are pressed within a given volume. We also calculated carbon stock. We looked at litter biomass and vegetation composition. We hypothesized that we would have higher root biomass and higher soil organic carbon and total carbon in our grazed plots. That's because that follows the same trend that Chris Wilson found in our improved pastures. We also expected to see higher bulk density in our grazed plots just due to the cattle coming in and compacting that soil, which would then give us higher carbon stocks in our grazed plots. We also expected lower litter biomass in the grazed area, seeing as the cattle would come in and eat the vegetation away. And then we did expect to see a difference between our vegetation composition with higher grass cover in our grazed plots than our ungrazed plots. In terms of soil depth, we expected all of our measures to decrease with soil depth except for bulk density. So as you go deeper into the soil becomes more compact, but then it loses some of its root biomass and soil organic carbon. So our study was done out here on Buck Island Ranch. On the left is a map of the entire Buck Island Ranch area. You can see there's two highlighted sections. That's part of the USDA Wetland Restoration Project. And we focused in on the East Marsh, which is that middle map there. And we looked at 5 different sample sites. They're marked with those numbers 31, 26, 25, 24, and 27. All of our sample sites within the East Marsh were in the Bradenton fine sand or Felda fine sand types, and they were all at similar elevations. On the far right is a picture of one of our exclosures at one of those sample sites. All of our exclosures were 10 meters by 10 meters, and they were put up in 2005, which means they've been ungrazed for 15 years. We then had our paired grazed plots just right outside of those exclosures in the grassy area next to it. As you can see in that exclosure, there's encroachment of trees and shrubs and things like that. In order to have more uniformity in our study, we focused on the grassy areas within those exclosures. So once we got it all set up, we headed out into the field and we took soil samples. We took 3 soil cores inside of each exclosure and 3 outside of each exclosure, all of them to 30 centimeter depth. We then broke that into a 0 to 5 centimeter segment, 5 to 15, and 15 to 30. We also took a vegetation composition survey, again, 3 inside and 3 outside each exclosure. And then we collected litter biomass in a 10 centimeter by 100 centimeter quadrat, again, in 3 outside and 3 inside each exclosure. Once we had all of our soil, we brought it back to the lab, we oven dried it, we then weighed it to be able to calculate bulk density, we sieved it to get root biomass, and then once the soil was sieved, some of it was ashed for organic matter, and then some of it was milled and shipped out to get total carbon percents. We also dried and weighed our litter for biomass back in the lab. Okay, so soil organic carbon only contains the carbon from organic matter, so we had to calculate that. So once we had our organic matter from ashing, we multiplied that by 58%, which is the agreed upon percent of carbon in organic matter. And that gave us our soil organic carbon content in a concentration, like a percent form. We also measured total carbon because that contains our organic and inorganic carbon, and it was important for us to see the impact of organic carbon out here on the ranch. We then measured our bulk density. So to do that, we took the weight of our soil and we divided it by the volume of the soil core. Once we had our bulk density, we were able to calculate our carbon stocks. So organic carbon stock is soil organic carbon times bulk density, and that's the amount of organic carbon per unit volume, where total carbon stock is total carbon times bulk density, and that's our inorganic and organic carbon per unit volume. We ran statistical analysis on all of our data. Anything that needed to be log transformed was done so to achieve normality. We then did linear mixed effect models to assess the impact of treatment and depth on each of our factors, so things like root biomass, bulk density, soil organic carbon. And then we did an AIC model selection to determine the most informative and parsimonious models. That way we were able to include several factors to see the best option for our analysis. Then we ran an NMDS analysis of our vegetation species composition. Okay, so this is our results for root biomass. Root biomass is our Y vertical axis here, and treatment is our X horizontal axis. As you can see on the right with our grazed section, they're all a little bit lower than the boxes on the left in our ungrazed section. So we did find that root biomass was greater in ungrazed plots. You can also see that that top red box is our top layer of soil, our 0 to 5 centimeter section, and the blue box is our 15 to 30 centimeter section. So as the soil depth goes down, our root biomass does decrease. So root biomass decreases with soil depth. This is bulk density. Bulk density is our Y vertical axis and treatment is our X horizontal axis. Has an opposite relationship with soil depth as we expected. You can see that the lower boxes are the top layer of soil, and as you go up the gradient, you're getting into the deeper section of the soil. So bulk density does increase with soil depth. We also can see that the grazed plots on the left there are a little bit higher than the ones on the right in the ungrazed section. So we did find that bulk density is greater in our grazed plots. In terms of soil carbon, we found all of our carbon levels, which is soil organic carbon, total carbon, and organic carbon stock and total carbon stock, to decrease with soil depth. We found there was no difference between soil organic carbon and total carbon in grazed and ungrazed plots, but we did see that root biomass had a positive relationship with our soil organic carbon, especially in those shallower soil depths, which makes sense since both root biomass and soil organic carbon decrease with soil depth. So we also looked at organic carbon stock, which is on the vertical y-axis here, and then we have root biomass on the x horizontal axis, and we have it broken into grazed and ungrazed sections. So as you can see, that top red 0 to 5 section of the soil in the grazed plot is higher than the red section in the ungrazed plot. So this is because root biomass significantly interacts with grazing treatment to allow our organic carbon stock to be greater in the grazed plots at that top layer of 0 to 5 centimeters. We can also see an organic carbon stock is increasing with root biomass at all depths, which is shown by these positive vertical slopes of all of our lines on this graph. Then total carbon stock is on our y-axis here. Root biomass is on our x-axis. We did find that total carbon stock is higher in our grazed plot, specifically in that top 0 to 5 centimeter section. So you can see the grazed top red line is higher than the ungrazed red line. You can also see that there is a difference between our slopes of our grazed lines and our ungrazed lines. This just further solidifies that there's a significant difference between grazed and ungrazed total carbon stock. So we also did run that vegetation composition survey. And once we had all of that data back, we combined them together to get an average dominant species table. And we found that grazing significantly reduces forb cover. So in this grazed section, you can see Axonopus fricatus and Ficifolius and Paspalum notatum. Those are both grass species and they are at high concentration. Whereas in the ungrazed section, Conoclinium colistinum and things like Phyllonotiflora and all these others, we have higher forb cover in that ungrazed section. We did not find any difference between diversity or species richness in our species analysis, our vegetation analysis, and we did not find any difference in litter biomass between grazed and ungrazed sections. So we took all of our vegetation data and we put it together in this vegetation ordination table, NMDS analysis. NMDS shows us how similar plots are based on their species composition. So our red dots are the grazed ones. They're all in that bottom lower left corner, where the ungrazed blue dots are kind of more spread out on the right upper side. You can see there's a definite distinction between our grazed and ungrazed plots. So this just shows that there's a difference between that species composition. Any of the points that are close together mean they have very similar species composition, and any points that are particularly close to the species themselves, so like Ampmu, Panhem, Phinod, Pasnot, that just means that that species is highly prevalent in that specific plot. We also overlaid our carbon levels on top of our vegetation ordination, and we found that there's not really a clear connection between vegetation species and carbon levels. Instead, it kind of varies among plots. So for example, the top 3 points in the left corner those 3 blue points. That's plot number 31, and they had really low carbon levels, so it would make sense that our carbon arrows are pointing in the exact opposite direction of that plot. Okay, so overall, we did not see higher root biomass in grazed plots as we expected. Instead, we saw higher root biomass in ungrazed plots. We also did not see higher soil organic carbon and total carbon in grazed plots. Instead, there was no difference between our grazed and ungrazed sections. We did see a higher bulk density in our grazed plots, which then allowed for us to have higher carbon stock in our grazed plots, especially in that top 0 to 5 centimeter section of our soil. We did not see any difference in our litter biomass between grazed and ungrazed, but we did see a significant difference in our vegetation composition between grazed and ungrazed plots, with grazed having higher grass cover than ungrazed. So going back to Chris Wilson's study on the improved pasture, I want to do a quick comparison between our studies here. Chris Wilson did find root biomass to be greater in the grazed section, while we found it to be greater in the ungrazed. He found no significant difference between bulk density, where we found bulk density to be greater in our grazed section. And then he found that soil organic carbon is greater in the grazed section, while we found no significant difference in soil organic carbon levels. This could be due to the fact that our semi-native pastures are pretty variable. As you can see from the standard deviation of semi-native soil organic carbon, it's much higher than the standard deviation of the improved pasture soil organic carbon levels. There are several reasons for the differences in the results of our study. It could be because the improved pastures have this huge dominance of Bahia grass. It could also be because improved pastures have passed phosphorus and nitrogen fertilization. They've also been limed, and they have higher animal use days than the semi-native pastures. But overall, we did find that grazing increases our soil carbon storage in semi-native pastures by increasing that bulk density. And grazing also maintains forage grasses, which are associated with our high carbon sequestration. More research does need to be done to determine how these different factors are impacting our soil carbon levels. So those things like fertilizer differences, vegetation, stocking rate, all of those things would need to be looked into more. But I think that our results are still showing that semi-native pastures have high potential for carbon storage and that grazing increases that potential. I just want to acknowledge the team out here at Archbold and Buck Island Ranch. Thank you all for your help during my internship here. Specifically, I want to shout out How You for his super awesome photos during this presentation. Thank you all. Does anyone have any questions?
Great, thank you, Caroline.
Yeah.
I do see one question in the Q&A box, and it's from Scott, and it says, is there a possible legacy effect of prior communities before the grazing experiment took place?
What does he mean by prior communities?
I think you mean, were the communities the same when the grazing exclosures were put in?
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of the semi-native pasture, I think it was all like vegetation communities. So I think all the vegetation was, semi-native. We had partial dominance of native grasses and then partial dominance of Bahia grass. And then they put those exclosures in, and it has been 15 years. So it's been quite a long time for that vegetation to change inside of that exclosure. But I think they were the same when they were put in.
And I agree with that. I think Patrick Bolin was the program director of agroecology at that time, and he specifically chose those sites so that there would be a nice paired plot between ungrazed and grazed vegetation. Hillary said she missed the beginning, but how long were these sites ungrazed?
15 years. The exclosures were put in 2005.
Okay, there is a question I see here. Is there any data to see carbon saturation sequestration in relation to this study and prescribed fire? Are you able to understand the effect of fire without grazing?
We did not specifically look into that. I can say that both our grazed and ungrazed sections in that East Marsh area were burned in March of 2019. So they were not burned this year, but they were burned last year. And I don't think that we took soil measurements prior to the burn and after the burn, but that would be a really interesting thing to look at. That's on the list of things to, do future studies on.
And here's a question from Madeline Mathis. What species of cattle were used? I have heard that soil compaction from the weight of cattle can make root system not as deep and change the plant species.
Okay, that's interesting. Out here at Buck Island Ranch, I think we have 4 different types of cattle. I know we have Brahmas and Angus and Charlotte something.
Yes, we have mostly crosses, the Angus and Brahman cross, which are called Brangus, and then Angus and Hereford crosses called Brayford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Greg Saunier asked, are improved still fertilized?
I think they're fertilized every couple years. Is that right, Betsy?
With nitrogen.
Yeah.
It's pretty spotty. It's not like every other year all improved pastures are fertilized, but some of them are every couple years, but we haven't fertilized with phosphorus since 1986.
Okay, yeah. Anything else?
Let me see. Yes, there's one more question. Would cow dung in grazed sections influence soil carbon cycling? From Amartya.
So, I mean, that's part of the nutrient cycle. The cattle are going to eat up the vegetation, it's going to go through them and then get released back into the soil through their poop, pretty much. So that definitely could be part of, the carbon cycle in that grazed section. We do not specifically look at the effect of cattle dung, but that's kind of part of the impact of grazing. When you do have an animal come through and graze, it's accepted that they're going to leave behind, their waste.
Hillary wanted to share that, going back to the question about the different cattle breeds, most of the data on hoof disturbance are from Western rangelands and not Eastern pastures. So this work here at the ranch is really important in filling an important data gap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
I think we have time for one more question. Hannah Van Zant asks, do you have any predictions for differences between pasture and sugarcane in terms of carbon storage?
That is a good question. I think that would come down to, what's happening underground. So I don't know too much about sugarcane root systems or how they sequester carbon, but I think that would be, the deciding factor is kind of like the vegetation differences, especially since sugarcane doesn't get grazed. It would only be the vegetation that's affecting it.
Okay, one more question popped up. Have there been any studies comparing soil health between grazed and ungrazed sections, meaning in terms of organisms in the soil / biodiversity?
Okay. So we looked at diversity of our plant species between grazed and ungrazed, and we did not find any difference in terms of worms and things, which might be what they're talking about. I am not quite sure. I could venture a guess into saying that I've definitely heard that grazing really improves your soil health. So I could venture a guess that says that grazing would allow for more like earthworms and stuff, but I'm not sure.
I do know that Patrick Bolin and colleagues did some work on microbial biomass, and they found
Mm-hmm.
greater microbial biomass in grazed sections in the improved pastures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. I think we are out of time and we have to move on to the next intern. So thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you to our audience. And Jean Lawless, our ranch manager, says, "Good job, Caroline."
Thank you.